Case 1. The courtroom in Flemington, New Jersey, sat in stunned silence as the jury foreman delivered the final verdict. Bruno Richard Hauptmann stood motionless, his face a mask of cold detachment. He was condemned to death in the electric chair. It was the conclusion of a case that had paralyzed a nation, a crime that began with a ladder against a nursery wall and ended with a legal execution that remains debated to this day. To understand how a quiet, German-born carpenter became the center of the trial of the century, we have to go back to a cold night in March 1932. Charles Lindbergh, the world-famous aviator who had achieved the impossible by flying solo across the Atlantic, lived a life of intense privacy in a secluded estate in Hopewell, New Jersey. On the evening of March 1st, his 20-month-old son, Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr., was put to bed. At 10 p.m., the child's nurse made a discovery that would trigger one of the largest investigative operations in American history. The crib was empty. Outside, leaning against the nursery window, police found a makeshift wooden ladder. On the windowsill sat a ransom note, written in broken English, demanding $50,000. The kidnapping of the most famous child in America became an immediate national obsession. Thousands of volunteers joined the search, and the New Jersey State Police, alongside federal authorities, launched a massive hunt. Throughout the spring, the investigation relied on a series of harrowing ransom notes. A retired school principal named Dr. John Condon acted as an intermediary, attempting to negotiate for the child's safety. In a secretive, midnight meeting at a Bronx cemetery, Condon handed over the ransom money. The child, however, was never returned. In May, just over 2 months after the abduction, the body of the toddler was discovered in a wooded area less than 5 miles from the Lindbergh estate. The medical examiner concluded the child had passed away shortly after the kidnapping occurred. For 2 years, the investigation stalled. Authorities chased thousands of dead ends until a simple transaction at a gas station changed everything. In September 1934, an attendant grew suspicious when a customer paid for gasoline with a rare gold certificate. The bills were traced back to the ransom money record. The attendant had possessed the foresight to jot down the customer's license plate number. Police traced the vehicle to a residence in the Bronx, where they apprehended Bruno Richard Hauptmann. A search of his garage uncovered approximately $14,600 of the original ransom cash. Investigators moved quickly to build a case that connected the carpenter to the crime. They argued that Hauptmann's handwriting matched the ransom notes, and they presented forensic analysis of the wood used to construct the ladder, claiming it originated from lumber found in Hauptmann's own attic. Furthermore, investigators found Dr. John Condon's phone number etched inside a closet in Hauptmann's home. The trial began in January 1935. It was a global media event, with journalists filling the small courthouse to witness the testimony of experts and police. The prosecution built a wall of evidence, centering on the financial links and the physical wood construction of the ladder. Hauptmann, throughout the proceedings, remained defiant. He claimed he was merely a victim of circumstance, insisting a deceased business associate had left the money in his garage without his knowledge. Despite his protests of innocence, the evidence, specifically the financial and forensic connections, proved insurmountable for the jury. Following 5 weeks of intense testimony, they returned a guilty verdict on charges of first-degree murder. Hauptmann's legal team filed multiple appeals, reaching the New Jersey Supreme Court and eventually petitioning the United States Supreme Court, but every attempt to overturn the conviction failed. On April 3, 1936, the sentence was carried out at New Jersey State Prison. Even as he faced the end, Hauptmann maintained that he had been wrongfully accused. The legacy of this case remains complex. While the state was confident in its forensic case, the execution of Hauptmann did not close the door on public debate. Some historians continue to examine the flaws in the investigation. What remains undeniable is the permanent shift in American law. The public outcry following the tragedy forced Congress to pass the Federal Kidnapping Act, commonly known as the Lindbergh Law, which granted federal authorities the power to pursue kidnappers across state lines. The case stands as a chilling study in how a singular, calculated crime can fundamentally rewrite the legal landscape of a nation. Case 2. The late 2016 announcement from the New Jersey authorities sent ripples through the state's criminal justice system. A newly analyzed DNA sample finally provided a definitive link between a long-dormant murder from 1965 and a man who had already been in the grave for 8 years. It was a posthumous revelation that finally closed a file that had remained open for half a century. To understand how one man managed to evade full accountability for decades, we must look at the shadows he cast over New Jersey throughout the 1960s. Robert Bob Zarinsky, born in Linden, New Jersey, in 1940, did not emerge into a life of crime suddenly. His early years were characterized by a recurring pattern of burglary, theft, and erratic behavior that frequently brought him into contact with local law enforcement. Even in his youth, those who encountered him described a volatility that made him a subject of concern. By the time he reached adulthood, Zarinsky's history had escalated from petty theft to interactions that police would later scrutinize with newfound intensity. The 1960s in New Jersey were marked by a series of unsettling disappearances involving teenage girls. These events were frequently treated as isolated incidents, with investigators in different jurisdictions failing to recognize the potential for a serial pattern. One of these cases involved 18-year-old Mary Agnes Klinsky, who was reported missing in 1965. Her disappearance, followed by the discovery of her remains, remained a classified cold case for over 50 years. Similarly, in 1968, 13-year-old Jane DeRua vanished, her life cut short in an act of violence that would stump detectives for decades. In August 1969, the pattern continued when 17-year-old Rosemary Calandriello disappeared from Atlantic Highlands. Witnesses at the time reported seeing a young woman matching her description entering a vehicle that was later tied to Zarinsky. This specific disappearance became the catalyst for an aggressive investigative pursuit. Unlike previous cases, detectives were able to construct a circumstantial trail that pointed directly to him. The subsequent 1975 trial for the murder of Rosemary Calandriello stands as a landmark in New Jersey legal history. It was the first time in the state that a murder conviction was secured without the recovery of the victim's body. The prosecution leaned heavily on witness testimony, forensic circumstantial evidence, and the documentation of Zarinsky's suspicious movements at the time of the disappearance. The jury returned a guilty verdict, and Zarinsky was sentenced to life imprisonment. For many, the 1975 conviction was the end of the story. However, the internal reality was far more complex. While serving his time, Zarinsky remained a prime suspect in multiple other unsolved disappearances involving young girls, including Linda Balabino, Doreen Carlucci, Joanne DeLardo, and Logan. Detectives continued to comb through properties connected to him, hoping to find physical remains or evidence that would solidify the link between his known criminal behavior and these other tragic cases. Throughout his imprisonment, Zarinsky maintained a tactic of total obfuscation. When questioned about the wider scope of his alleged crimes, he provided contradictory accounts, admitting involvement in some scenarios only to deny it later. Investigators concluded that these shifting stories were calculated efforts to exert control or bargain for better conditions within the prison system. The result was a stagnant investigative process where facts were frequently buried under layers of psychological manipulation. The advancement of DNA technology in the 21st century eventually dismantled the barriers that had protected Zarinsky's secrets. In 2008, prosecutors were finally prepared to indict him for the 1968 murder of Jane DeRua, after modern forensic testing of old evidence provided a definitive genetic match. However, the legal system was thwarted by natural forces. Zarinsky passed away in prison from pulmonary fibrosis before he could stand trial for this second offense. Even his death did not halt the work of forensic investigators. By 2016, refined DNA testing techniques allowed the state to re-examine evidence from the 1965 Mary Agnes Klinsky case. The results confirmed what detectives had suspected for decades. Zarinsky had been the responsible party. The legacy of the Robert Zarinsky investigation is a testament to the persistence of forensic science. For the families involved, the delay in resolution caused decades of profound grief, often complicated by the fact that some parents passed away before the truth was legally verified. His case remains a chilling reminder of how individuals who move through society with apparent normalcy can hide horrific patterns of behavior beneath a veneer of deception. It also underscores the importance of retaining evidence. What was once considered a dead-end lead in 1965 became the ultimate proof of guilt in 2016. Justice, in the case of Zarinsky, was not swift, but it was eventually absolute. Case 3. The television screen in a suburban Virginia living room flickered as America's Most Wanted presented a forensic reconstruction. It was 1989, and the image on the screen was a detailed, age-progressed bust of a man who had vanished 18 years earlier. That single broadcast triggered a phone call that dismantled a decade-long charade. The man living under the identity of Robert Clark was not a mild-mannered accountant, but John Emil List, a man who had orchestrated one of the most calculated family massacres in American history. To understand the sheer scale of this deception, we must return to the quiet, affluent neighborhood of Westfield, New Jersey, in the autumn of 1971. John List was, by all outward appearances, a model citizen. A veteran of the United States military with a business degree, he worked as a professional accountant. He was deeply religious, disciplined, and resided in a sprawling Victorian mansion with his wife, Helen, their 3 children, and his elderly mother, Alma. His neighbors viewed him as a pillar of the community, a man whose life was governed by order and religious devotion. Beneath the surface of this suburban existence, a financial collapse was unfolding. List had lost his job and struggled to secure new employment, yet he maintained the facade of a successful executive. As debts mounted and the family's lifestyle became unsustainable, List reached a conclusion that horrified investigators when it was later revealed. He convinced himself that his family was destined for poverty and that they were drifting away from their faith. In a manifestation of extreme, distorted logic, he decided that taking their lives was the only way to save their souls before they could face the disgrace of financial ruin. On November 9, 1971, List began a methodical, multi-stage execution of his plan. He shot his wife and mother inside the home, placing their bodies in the mansion. Throughout the day, he waited for his children to return from school, one by one, before ending their lives. Following the murders, List did not immediately flee. He engaged in a chillingly calm cleanup effort. He placed the remains in sleeping bags, adjusted the thermostat to slow the rate of decomposition, and left a series of letters for his pastor and friends. These letters contained his confession, detailing his belief that he had performed a moral service for his family. He then walked out of the house, locked the door, and disappeared into the anonymity of the American landscape. It took weeks for the community to realize something was wrong. Neighbors assumed the family had departed on a long vacation. When concern eventually led the police to break into the mansion, they discovered the site of a massacre that had remained silent for nearly a month. The case quickly became the focus of a nationwide manhunt, but John List had successfully shed his former life. He relocated to Virginia, assumed the name Robert Clark, and integrated himself into a new community, working as an accountant and even remarrying. He lived this life for 18 years, effectively hiding in plain sight. The investigative turning point arrived in 1989. The producers of America's Most Wanted collaborated with a forensic artist to project how John List would look after nearly 2 decades of aging. The resulting bust was a striking, near-perfect likeness. Shortly after the episode aired, a viewer recognized the face from his local community and alerted the FBI. Agents moved in, and List was taken into custody in Virginia without resistance. His trial in 1990 provided the public with a glimpse into a mind that had functioned with cold, clinical detachment. During the proceedings, List maintained his composure, showing no outward sign of remorse. His defense team attempted to leverage an insanity plea, citing the extreme pressure of his life and his distorted religious convictions, but the jury rejected this argument. The prosecution presented the cold, tactical nature of his preparations, the cleaning of the crime scene, the letters, and the calculated timing, as proof of premeditation and full mental awareness. The jury convicted John List on 5 counts of first-degree murder. The judge handed down 5 consecutive life sentences, ensuring he would never return to society. List spent the remainder of his days in prison, where he gave multiple interviews attempting to rationalize his actions, though his arguments failed to sway criminologists or the public. He died in custody in 2008. The John List case serves as a dark study in the failure of public detection and the dangers of extreme, isolated obsession. It highlights the vulnerability of domestic settings and the extreme lengths an individual can go to when they prioritize the preservation of a public image over the lives of those they are charged to protect. For investigators, the case remains a hallmark of persistence, demonstrating that even when a suspect successfully vanishes, modern forensic art and public awareness can reach across decades to ensure accountability. It stands as a reminder that the most dangerous threats sometimes reside within the most quiet, unassuming homes. Case 4. The investigation into the activities of Joseph Kallinger remains a disturbing case study on the intersection of severe mental instability, systemic failure, and the manipulation of a minor. Between 1974 and 1975, Kallinger, a Philadelphia-based shoemaker, engaged in a series of violent offenses that spanned Pennsylvania, Maryland, and New Jersey. What began as a series of burglaries rapidly escalated into a spree that left law enforcement grappling with a suspect who claimed to be acting under the direction of supernatural voices. Joseph Kallinger's life was marked by long-standing documented issues. He had been a ward of the state during his youth and had been institutionalized multiple times for mental health crises, including attempted suicide and behavior that medical staff identified as consistent with paranoid schizophrenia. Despite these red flags, the legal and medical systems repeatedly returned him to the community. By 1974, his condition had deteriorated to a point where he perceived himself to be on a divine mission. Instead of preventing the resulting escalation, the justice system remained reactive, and Kallinger's behavior continued to spiral unchecked. The most critical and tragic turn in this timeline occurred in 1974, when Kallinger began involving his 12-year-old son, Michael Kallinger, in his criminal activities. This dynamic of control and psychological dominance ensured that a child was placed directly into the path of extreme danger. The pair adopted a tactic of posing as door-to-door salesmen to gain entry into homes. Once inside, the pretense of commerce vanished, replaced by armed intimidation. These were not random acts of opportunity. They were targeted, methodical invasions that systematically stripped families of their safety. On January 8, 1975, the spree culminated in a prolonged hostage crisis in Leonia, New Jersey. The Kallingers entered a private residence, where they eventually held multiple victims captive in a basement throughout the day. The situation became increasingly volatile as additional visitors arrived at the house, only to be overpowered and restrained. Among those who entered the home unaware of the danger was 21-year-old Maria Fashing, a visiting nurse. When she resisted the demands of the intruders, Joseph Kallinger took her life in a brutal act of violence. This murder marked the point of no return, shifting the police response from a robbery investigation to a high-priority homicide and hostage situation. The hostage crisis ended when one of the bound survivors managed to break free from the basement, fleeing the property and alerting neighbors, who immediately contacted the police. Joseph and Michael Kallinger fled the scene before authorities could secure the perimeter, but the trail they left behind was dense with evidence. They abandoned clothing and weapons, items that allowed forensic investigators to quickly establish a definitive link to the suspect. Within days, law enforcement tracked the pair and took both Joseph and Michael into custody. The subsequent legal proceedings focused on the mental state of the perpetrator. During questioning and the resulting trial, Kallinger testified that his actions were the result of delusions, claiming he was merely an instrument of supernatural forces. His defense attorneys leaned heavily into an insanity plea, bringing forth psychiatric evaluations to support the diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia. However, the prosecution successfully argued that the methodical nature of the crimes, the planning of the routes, the selection of the houses, and the deliberate steps taken to deceive victims, demonstrated that Kallinger retained a functional understanding of his actions and their legal consequences. The fate of Michael Kallinger presented a distinct legal and moral challenge. The court recognized that the 12-year-old had been subject to the psychological dominance of his father for years. Rather than treating him as an adult criminal, the system placed him in a juvenile facility, acknowledging the extreme nature of his coerced participation. He eventually transitioned back into society under a different identity, attempting to live a life separate from the shadow of his father's actions. Joseph Kallinger was convicted on multiple counts of murder, kidnapping, and robbery. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, effectively removing him from society. Even while incarcerated, his behavior remained erratic, leading to transfers between correctional facilities and hospitals until his death in 1996. The Kallinger case forced a re-examination of how the judicial system handles defendants with documented, severe mental illnesses, particularly when those individuals demonstrate a capacity for premeditation. For investigators and criminologists, the case serves as a harrowing lesson in the importance of consistent, long-term monitoring for individuals with violent, well-documented psychological issues. It underscores the failure of institutional systems to provide adequate protection to the public when known warning signs are treated with bureaucratic indifference. Ultimately, the Kallinger case remains a tragic example of how the lack of intervention at the early stages of mental health deterioration can lead to devastating, irreversible outcomes for families and communities. Case 5. The final entry in the police log at a Hasbrouck Heights motel in May 1980 did not read like the end of a typical robbery. It read like the conclusion of a decade-long shadow hunt. When officers burst into the room, they interrupted an active, violent assault, rescuing a young woman who had been restrained and severely injured. They apprehended a man who, by all appearances, led an utterly mundane existence as a computer operator and family man. That man was Richard Cottingham. His capture on that spring evening was not just an arrest. It was the abrupt, forced termination of a criminal career that had terrorized the New York and New Jersey metropolitan areas for nearly 15 years. To understand how he remained hidden for so long, we must look at the nature of his methods and the systemic gaps that allowed him to strike with impunity. Throughout the late 1960s and 1970s, the region was plagued by a series of disappearances that defied local law enforcement's ability to find a common thread. Women, often traveling alone or working late-night shifts, would simply vanish. The cases were handled by separate jurisdictions, from New York City precincts to suburban New Jersey departments, with almost no interagency communication. In an era before centralized criminal databases and integrated DNA processing, each disappearance was treated as a localized event. This siloed approach created a vacuum of information that Cottingham exploited with calculated precision. The perpetrator possessed a disturbing ability to segment his life. By day, he occupied a professional, stable space in the workforce, appearing to neighbors as a devoted family man with children. He fit the profile of the hidden predator, someone whose domestic stability acted as an impenetrable shield against suspicion. Behind closed doors, however, investigations would later reveal a personality defined by a desire for total control and extreme cruelty. As the years progressed, the press took note of the brutal conditions in which several victims were eventually discovered. The media moniker, the Torso Killer, was coined during this period, turning the unknown predator into a symbol of fear. The nickname itself was a manifestation of the killer's signature, the extreme, clinical violence he visited upon his victims to prevent identification. This act of dismemberment was not merely an attempt to hide the identity of the person. It was an attempt to stymie the forensic capabilities of the time. The investigation was plagued by the technological limitations of the era. Forensic science was in its infancy, and physical evidence collected from the early crime scenes was often degraded or insufficient to provide a DNA profile. Detectives followed hundreds of leads, but the lack of a modern, multi-state communication network meant that if a suspect was questioned in one town, his record in another remained buried in paper files. Witness testimony was scarce, as the victims were often targeted in vulnerable, isolated situations where no third party could intervene or observe. The turning point in May 1980 was a result of immediate, reactive police intervention rather than long-term strategic profiling. The officers who interrupted the assault in Hasbrouck Heights stopped a murder in progress. This arrest provided the forensic and testimonial smoking gun that detectives had spent over a decade searching for. In the weeks following the arrest, the police initiated a methodical search of Cottingham's home and vehicle. They began to recover trophies, personal items belonging to victims from years prior, that acted as the bridge between his domestic persona and his criminal reality. The sheer volume of evidence linked him to a string of cold cases that had haunted the region since the late 1960s. Detectives began the arduous process of re-interviewing witnesses and re-examining crime scene reports, finally connecting the dots across jurisdictions that had previously operated in isolation. The legal aftermath saw Cottingham convicted of multiple counts of murder. The testimonies provided during the trial painted a portrait of a calculated individual who sought to outmaneuver the authorities at every turn. He was handed multiple life sentences, ensuring he would never return to society. Even after his conviction, the scope of his crimes remained a subject of intense scrutiny, with authorities continuing to examine unsolved disappearances from the 1970s to see if he was connected. The legacy of the Cottingham case is less about the man himself and more about the evolution of the criminal justice system. It forced police departments to abandon their insular operations in favor of regional cooperation and digital information sharing. It highlighted the critical need for advancements in forensic science, the very advancements that eventually solidified the cases against him. His story remains a stark lesson in how an individual can utilize the cracks in a fragmented legal system to sustain a career of violence. For those who survived and for the families who finally received answers, the closure was hard-won, serving as a permanent reminder that the image of the ordinary neighbor can sometimes conceal the most complex and dangerous of secrets. Case 6. The revelation that a series of victims had been buried on property tied to Richard Biegenwald in 1983 remains a foundational example of systemic failure within the American correctional system. For years, the public had been led to believe that the justice system had addressed the threat Biegenwald posed, only to witness the return of a predator who had been granted the freedom to operate within society once more. To understand the gravity of these events, we must examine the timeline of a man who demonstrated that previous convictions, when met with insufficient parole oversight, could serve as a precursor to even greater acts of violence. Richard Biegenwald, born in 1949, exhibited a long-term trajectory of criminal behavior that began early in his life. His early records were filled with offenses involving theft and violent aggression. In 1958, Biegenwald committed the murder of Stephen Sladowski, a crime that served as a clear indicator of his capacity for lethal violence. Despite the severity of this early act, the legal system of the era ultimately permitted him to be released. This early release remains a point of intense scrutiny for historians and criminologists, as it highlights a period when the institutional focus failed to account for the high probability of recidivism in cases involving extreme violence. By the 1970s, Biegenwald was back on the streets, having served time and been granted parole. He settled in Monmouth County, New Jersey, maintaining a life that allowed him to blend into the suburban landscape. To his immediate neighbors, he appeared to be an unremarkable, quiet man, successfully shielding his true nature behind a facade of normalcy. However, law enforcement officials later argued that this period of relative silence was merely the precursor to a much larger, more calculated criminal endeavor. The investigation that would eventually expose him began in 1982, when 17-year-old Deborah Dudley disappeared. Her failure to return home triggered an immediate, large-scale search by her family and local authorities. For weeks, the case yielded little information, as there were no witnesses to her departure and no direct forensic leads. The uncertainty surrounding her disappearance created a state of panic throughout the Monmouth County area, as families realized that a predatory threat was active within their community. As detectives cross-referenced recent disappearances with known violent offenders living in the area, Biegenwald's name surfaced. He was already under observation for other suspicious activities, and when witnesses placed him in close proximity to the timeline of Deborah Dudley's disappearance, the investigation intensified. Detectives began the process of building a comprehensive timeline of his movements, applying pressure that forced him to reveal his true activities. The turning point occurred in 1983, when investigators secured search warrants for property connected to Biegenwald. What the police uncovered during the excavation fundamentally altered the scale of the case. They located the remains of multiple victims, confirming that the disappearance of Deborah Dudley was not an isolated incident, but part of a serial pattern. The discovery turned a singular homicide investigation into the pursuit of a serial predator. It became clear that Biegenwald had been using the land to conceal his actions, operating under the assumption that his quiet, suburban life would shield him from such a deep forensic search. During the subsequent interrogations, Biegenwald maintained a calm, calculating demeanor. He offered little insight into his psychological state, refusing to provide specific details about the crimes. Investigators, meanwhile, worked to reconstruct the lost lives of the victims found on the property. They discovered that many of these individuals had disappeared years earlier under mysterious circumstances, their cases having gone cold due to a lack of interconnected police data. The evidence recovered, ranging from personal effects to biological markers, provided the prosecution with the necessary foundation to build a case that would ensure he would never return to society. The trial that followed became a landmark event in New Jersey. Prosecutors presented a detailed forensic analysis of the property, connecting Biegenwald to each victim through a combination of physical evidence and circumstantial timelines. Family members of the victims provided testimony that underscored the agonizing years of uncertainty they had endured. The jury found Biegenwald guilty on multiple counts of murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison. The legacy of the Biegenwald case is one of administrative and systemic accountability. It forced a national conversation regarding the parole of violent offenders who have proven records of lethal behavior. The case remains a stark reminder of the limitations of rehabilitation models when they are applied to individuals who exhibit an escalation in violent patterns. It also highlighted the vital importance of persistence in cold case investigations. Had the detectives in 1982 not pushed for a forensic search of the property, the truth regarding the other victims might have remained buried indefinitely. Ultimately, the Biegenwald case serves as an educational model for the importance of rigorous background monitoring and institutional transparency. It stands as a cautionary study on why the justice system must prioritize public safety protocols, particularly when dealing with repeat offenders whose histories indicate a clear, unyielding pattern of harm. Case 7. The early 1980s in New Jersey were defined by an atmosphere of apprehension, as a series of unexplained disappearances involving young women began to haunt the suburban landscape. For law enforcement, the challenge lay in deciphering whether these events were isolated tragedies or the work of a single, calculated predator. The investigation into James Koedatich would ultimately reveal the latter, providing a chilling look at how an individual with a documented history of violence could maneuver through a system that failed to adequately restrict his movements. James Koedatich, born in 1948, had established a pattern of aggressive behavior that brought him into contact with the law from his young adulthood. His criminal record was not a sequence of minor infractions but a progression of violent offenses. Despite serving time for previous crimes, his release back into society occurred without the level of scrutiny required for someone with his propensity for harm. It was this failure of the oversight system that created the window for his activities in the early 1980s. The investigative focus intensified following the disappearance of 23-year-old Grace McAllister. She was last seen leaving her place of work, an event that should have been the unremarkable end to a routine day. Instead, it marked the beginning of a desperate search that engaged local police and family members alike. When her remains were discovered in a wooded area, the crime scene offered investigators almost no tangible evidence. The lack of struggle or witnesses left detectives with an empty file, but the method of the crime suggested an offender who was both patient and experienced in avoiding detection. Shortly thereafter, the disappearance of Donna Richmond occurred under eerily similar circumstances. The pattern was becoming clear. The victims were being intercepted in areas where they were vulnerable, then taken to secluded locations where the offender could operate without risk of observation. The identification of this serial pattern was the crucial turning point for law enforcement. It allowed departments to move beyond treating these cases as separate missing persons reports and instead view them as a unified criminal enterprise. As the investigation expanded, detectives embarked on a painstaking review of every lead, witness statement, and forensic clue. They interviewed hundreds of individuals, mapping the movements of potential suspects against the timestamps of the disappearances. The breakthrough arrived when investigators successfully linked James Koedatich to the crime scenes through physical evidence, a combination of tire track analysis and biological markers that matched his profile. The detectives were finally able to place him in the precise locations where the victims had last been seen. Koedatich's arrest did not conclude the investigation. It merely opened the door to a deeper understanding of his methods. During subsequent questioning, detectives uncovered a modus operandi that relied on the calculated manipulation of trust. Koedatich would either gain the compliance of his victims through a facade of friendliness or force them into vulnerable situations where they could not signal for help. This tactical approach to his crimes allowed him to minimize the risk of witnesses and maximize his control over the encounter. The trial drew significant media attention, serving as a public reckoning for the fear that had gripped the region for months. Prosecutors presented a detailed forensic map of the crimes, supported by the testimony of experts who explained how the evidence collected at the scenes inextricably linked the defendant to the murders. The courtroom was filled with the families of the victims, who had waited months for the legal process to provide answers to the questions that had occupied their lives since their loved ones vanished. Despite a defense that questioned the circumstantial nature of certain leads, the jury returned a guilty verdict, finding Koedatich responsible for multiple murders. He was initially sentenced to death, placing him on New Jersey's death row. Following the state's decision to abolish capital punishment, his sentence was commuted to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. He remains incarcerated today, his name now permanently linked to a chapter of New Jersey history that underscored the urgent necessity of interdepartmental communication in law enforcement. The case of James Koedatich is a definitive study in how a serial offender utilizes the blind spots of regional law enforcement to sustain a career of violence. It highlights the importance of recognizing crime patterns early, showing that what may appear to be an isolated event is often a signal of a larger, systemic threat. For the families of the victims, the conviction provided a measure of justice, yet the tragedy serves as a perennial reminder of the vulnerability of individuals in daily transit. It underscores the vital importance of alert, coordinated investigative work in preventing the continuation of such predatory behavior, emphasizing that the persistence of detectives is often the only barrier between a serial offender and their next intended victim. Case 8. In the summer of 2004, the Chesapeake Bay became the site of a grim discovery that would launch one of the most complex homicide investigations in New Jersey history. What began as the report of a missing person, a computer programmer named Bill Maguire, quickly evolved into a high-stakes forensic puzzle involving 3 abandoned suitcases floating in the water. The investigation into the death of Bill Maguire exposed a calculated effort to evade detection, revealing a web of deception that ultimately placed his wife, Melanie Maguire, at the center of a national media storm. To understand how the truth was uncovered, we must look at the procedural timeline that dismantled a story of domestic normalcy. Melanie and Bill Maguire resided in Woodbridge Township, New Jersey, where they maintained the outward appearance of a successful professional household. Melanie was a registered nurse, and Bill worked as a computer programmer. However, beneath this suburban veneer, the couple faced mounting financial pressure and significant marital discord. By early 2004, their relationship had become increasingly strained, marked by emotional distance and disagreements regarding their future. In late April 2004, Bill Maguire suddenly vanished. Melanie informed their circle of friends and family that Bill had simply departed, choosing to walk away from their life together. Because he was an adult who had left of his own volition in the eyes of the initial responders, there was little immediate evidence of foul play. For several weeks, the narrative of a husband leaving his family remained unchallenged, as no immediate criminal activity was detected. The investigation shifted dramatically in May 2004, when fishermen operating in the Chesapeake Bay discovered a suitcase adrift. The contents were identified as human remains. Shortly thereafter, authorities recovered 2 additional suitcases in the same general vicinity, each containing further body parts. Forensic analysis was able to confirm that the victim was William Maguire. The nature of the discovery, the dismemberment and the specific disposal method, immediately turned the inquiry into a major criminal investigation, involving coordination between New Jersey and Maryland law enforcement. Detectives began a systematic reconstruction of Bill's final days. They audited his digital footprint, financial accounts, and personal communications. The investigation soon narrowed its focus toward Melanie Maguire. A forensic review of her personal life revealed that she had been involved in an affair with a physician she met at the hospital where she worked. This provided the prosecution with a potential motive, suggesting that Melanie had sought a new life free from the constraints of her marriage. The case against Melanie was built on a foundation of circumstantial evidence that was meticulously gathered over several months. Investigators discovered that shortly before Bill's disappearance, Melanie had legally purchased a handgun. While the firearm itself was never recovered, the receipt and the timing of the purchase became a cornerstone of the prosecution's argument. Police also cross-referenced surveillance footage from highway tolls, credit card receipts, and telephone records. These records established a timeline that directly contradicted Melanie's original account of her movements during the days following Bill's disappearance. The trial, which captivated the public in 2007, relied on the strength of this timeline. Prosecutors argued that Melanie had driven hundreds of miles to dispose of the evidence, attempting to relocate the suitcases to areas that would make the investigation as difficult as possible. Forensic experts provided testimony on the logistics of the disposal, arguing that the planning required to commit the act was inconsistent with the behavior of an innocent person. Melanie maintained her innocence throughout the proceedings, with her defense team emphasizing the lack of a direct eyewitness and the absence of the murder weapon. After weeks of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on counts of murder, desecration of human remains, and perjury. Melanie Maguire was sentenced to life in prison, with parole eligibility only after the completion of a significant term. Even after the conviction, the case remained a subject of intense discussion among legal analysts and true crime observers. Supporters of the defense continued to point to the lack of direct physical evidence at the scene of the crime, while proponents of the verdict argued that the overwhelming weight of the forensic data, the receipts, the toll records, and the purchase timeline, created a clear, undeniable picture of intent and execution. The Melanie Maguire case serves as an essential study in the power of forensic auditing. It demonstrates how modern investigators can piece together a narrative using digitized breadcrumbs, toll records, financial statements, and electronic communication, even in the absence of a direct witness. For the criminal justice system, the case became a definitive example of how circumstantial evidence, when meticulously organized, can reach the threshold of beyond a reasonable doubt. It remains a stark reminder that in the modern era, an individual's digital and physical movements leave a trail that, if analyzed with sufficient precision, can expose even the most carefully orchestrated attempts to hide the truth. For the families involved, the trial concluded a period of profound uncertainty, even as the details of the crime continue to serve as a landmark case in the history of New Jersey's criminal proceedings. Case 9. The courtroom in Essex County, New Jersey, stood in near total silence as the sentence was handed down. 160 years. It was a staggering duration, a mathematical certainty that the man standing at the defense table, Khalil Wheeler-Weaver, would never again walk free. He had been convicted of 3 counts of murder, the attempted murder of a 4th woman, and a string of related offenses including kidnapping, aggravated sexual assault, and arson. To understand how he was finally stopped, we have to look back at the chaotic final months of 2016, when a digital trail finally outpaced a predator who believed he was invisible. Khalil Wheeler-Weaver was 20 years old when he began his spree, operating out of Orange, New Jersey. He utilized a specific method of predation, the exploitation of social networking and dating applications. Under various online aliases, such as Liliot Rock and Pimp Killer Ghost, he targeted young women, many of whom were marginalized or struggling with homelessness. He offered money in exchange for companionship, establishing a veneer of transactional normalcy before luring them to secluded locations. The spree began in late August 2016. On August 31st, 19-year-old Robin West vanished from Newark. Days later, her remains were discovered inside an abandoned house in Orange, which had been set on fire to conceal the crime. Shortly after, 33-year-old Joan Brown was reported missing. In December 2016, her body was located in another vacant residence on Highland Avenue. Around the same time, the search for 20-year-old Sarah Butler, a college student from Montclair, reached its tragic conclusion when her remains were found in a nearby park. The investigation initially moved in separate, often disconnected lanes. Because the victims were frequently from transient or marginalized communities, the systemic attention required to recognize a serial pattern was painfully slow to mobilize. The critical investigative breakthrough did not come from a centralized police database, but from the tenacity of the victims' own social circles. Friends of Sarah Butler, refusing to accept the narrative of a simple missing person, took matters into their own hands. They gained access to her social media profiles, reconstructed her last known interactions, and eventually created a deceptive, fake account to initiate contact with the suspect. They successfully lured Wheeler-Weaver to a meeting point in Montclair and immediately alerted law enforcement, who were waiting to take him into custody. Once the suspect was in police hands, the procedural depth of the investigation finally took hold. Detectives moved to secure digital evidence that would ultimately seal the case. They obtained warrants for Wheeler-Weaver's phone records, which provided a devastatingly precise timeline. Geolocation data placed his device at the exact locations where his victims were last seen, and significantly, at the vacant houses where their bodies were later recovered. The digital breadcrumbs were incontrovertible. The trial, held in 2019, focused on the forensic links and the testimony of the sole survivor, Tiffany Taylor. Taylor's account provided a chilling look at the predator's methodology. She had been lured to a motel in Elizabeth, restrained, and subjected to a brutal assault. Her survival was a matter of sheer resilience. She had regained consciousness during the attack, convinced the perpetrator to drive her back to her motel by feigning compliance, and subsequently locked him out while calling 911. Her survival provided the prosecution with a living witness to his intent and the mechanical nature of his violence. The prosecution's case was a masterclass in forensic reconstruction. They presented the geolocation mapping, the search history on his phone, which included inquiries about homemade poison and missing persons, and the DNA evidence recovered from the scenes. The jury needed less than 3 hours to find him guilty on all counts. The 160-year sentence served as a definitive response to the systemic indifference that had initially allowed Wheeler-Weaver to operate. For the families of Robin West, Joan Brown, and Sarah Butler, the trial brought a measure of accountability, though it could never restore what had been taken. The case serves as a dark lesson on the necessity of digital vigilance and the importance of cross-referencing disparate case files. It also highlights the catastrophic failure of initial investigative responses in marginalized communities, where early warning signs were ignored. The Wheeler-Weaver case remains a pivot point in New Jersey law enforcement, forcing a reckoning with how missing person cases involving vulnerable individuals must be prioritized. It reminds us that justice is often the result of not just state machinery, but the courage of those who refuse to let the stories of the vanished go untold. Case 10. The arrest of Charles Cullen in December 2003 brought a definitive, albeit chilling, conclusion to a 16-year period of undetected criminal activity within the healthcare sector. Cullen, a registered nurse who had cycled through 9 hospitals and 1 nursing home across New Jersey and Pennsylvania, had become one of the most prolific serial offenders in American history. His capture was not the result of a coordinated multi-state intelligence operation, but rather the internal vigilance of his peers and a systematic failure of institutional oversight. To understand the gravity of this case, we must examine how a figure entrusted with the most vulnerable members of society managed to exploit the gaps in hospital reporting protocols for nearly 2 decades. Charles Edmund Cullen was born in West Orange, New Jersey, in 1960. His upbringing was marked by early family tragedy and significant psychological distress, including multiple suicide attempts during his adolescence. Despite these documented history-taking episodes, he successfully graduated from nursing school and secured employment at St. Barnabas Medical Center in 1987. It was here, within the clinical environment, that his pattern of administrative and procedural manipulation began. The methodology employed by Cullen was deceptively clinical. He did not use traditional weapons. He utilized his access to potent, regulated medications, specifically insulin and digoxin. By administering unauthorized, lethal doses to patients under his care, he was able to cause sudden, unexplained physiological collapses. These deaths were frequently misidentified by hospital staff as complications arising from the patient's already critical health conditions. For 16 years, Cullen moved from one institution to the next. A recurring, systemic failure emerged. Whenever administrators noticed a suspicious spike in patient fatalities on Cullen's shift, they opted for internal investigations or quiet dismissals to avoid the legal liability and public scandal associated with a formal report to the Board of Nursing or local law enforcement. This hush-hush culture of liability protection allowed Cullen to maintain a clean professional reference, which he then used to obtain employment at the next hospital. He was effectively passed along by institutions that valued their corporate reputation over the safety of the patients they were legally and ethically obligated to protect. The investigation that finally halted his spree began in 2003 at Somerset Medical Center. Staff members noted an alarming increase in medication errors and unexpected patient deaths that defied standard clinical expectations. Specialists from the New Jersey Poison Information and Education System observed these patterns and formally warned the hospital's administration. When administrators eventually contacted the authorities, detectives began a silent, methodical surveillance of Cullen's professional activities. The breakthrough relied on the cooperation of Amy Luffren, a fellow nurse who had become a close associate of Cullen. Initially, Luffren believed him to be a dedicated colleague, but as detectives presented her with the timeline of suspicious events, she realized the magnitude of his deception. She agreed to assist the investigation, engaging in recorded conversations with Cullen that revealed his thought processes and his admissions regarding the medication administration. Her cooperation was the linchpin that transitioned the suspicion into a prosecutable criminal case. Upon his arrest, Cullen provided a series of confessions that shocked both law enforcement and the public. He admitted to killing patients over many years, offering a self-serving justification that he was merely ending their suffering, a claim that investigators and medical experts unequivocally rejected. Many of his victims were not terminally ill, and his actions lacked any clinical or moral justification. As the legal process unfolded, the state reached a plea agreement that required Cullen to assist in identifying the full scope of his victims. He pled guilty to 29 confirmed murders, though he confessed to around 40, and criminologists suspect the true number of lives lost may reach into the hundreds. The judge sentenced him to 18 consecutive life terms, a mandate that effectively ensured he would never be eligible for parole. The Cullen investigation remains a profound indictment of the healthcare industry's internal accountability structures. It revealed a catastrophic failure of institutions to act in the interest of patient safety when faced with potential legal risk. The case forced a nationwide reevaluation of nursing license tracking, hospital reporting protocols, and the hiring practices of medical facilities. It serves as a reminder that the most significant threats to public safety can sometimes occur in the very places designed to foster recovery. For the families who lost loved ones, justice was eventually served, but it arrived only after the systemic safeguards had failed repeatedly. The Cullen case stands as an advocacy-driven call to action for the healthcare sector, emphasizing that institutional transparency must always supersede the protection of a professional facade. For the public, it reinforces the necessity of vigilance, ensuring that oversight is not just an administrative duty, but a consistent, enforceable commitment to the preservation of life. As we look back at the investigative records of these 10 cases, one realization becomes inescapable. The most dangerous threats did not just emerge from the shadows, they were often enabled by the silence of the systems meant to protect us. When institutions prioritize their own reputation over transparency, or when warning signs are dismissed as mere anomalies, who is ultimately responsible for the safety of the community? Is justice defined by the moment a predator is finally apprehended, or by the years of systemic failure that were allowed to occur before that moment arrived? We invite you to share your thoughts on where we draw the line between institutional accountability and individual vigilance. If you found this deep dive into the archives valuable and wish to support fact-based, responsible true crime storytelling, please hit the subscribe button. By doing so, you help ensure that these lessons in prevention and systemic reform continue to be examined. Thanks for watching.